They were not kings or warriors. They were not born into castles or anointed by any church. The Medici family of Florence began as wool merchants and apothecaries. Medici, the word that eventually became their name, means physicians in Italian, and the 6 red balls on their coat of arms are said to derive from the pills or coins of their original trade. They were, in the most literal sense, men of business. And from that beginning, over 3 centuries, they financed the construction of some of the most important buildings in European history, employed virtually every great artist of the Italian Renaissance, placed 2 of their sons on the throne of St. Peter, married 2 of their daughters into the French royal family, and, in their final act, gave the entire accumulated treasure of their dynasty to the city of Florence, with the legal stipulation that it could never be removed. The Uffizi Gallery, which today houses Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Primavera, Raphael's Madonna of the Goldfinch, and dozens of other works that define what Western painting is, exists because of a clause in a document signed in 1737. Without that clause, those paintings might be in Vienna, or Paris, or dispersed across European private collections. They are in Florence because the last of the Medici decided that they should be, and because she had the legal standing to make that decision binding. This is the story of how a family of Florentine bankers spent 300 years turning money into civilization. Giovanni de' Medici, the invisible foundation. The man who built the financial foundation of the Medici Empire was Giovanni de' Medici, born around 1360 and dead in 1429. He was not, by temperament, a man who sought attention. His most frequently quoted advice to his son Cosimo was, "Keep out of the public eye, do not oppose the law, and never display your wealth." This counsel, stay invisible, accumulate quietly, make yourself indispensable to people with power, was the operating philosophy of the early Medici, and it worked with remarkable consistency. Giovanni founded the Banco dei Medici in 1397. The bank's decisive advantage over its competitors was a relationship Giovanni cultivated with the papacy. Specifically with Baldassare Casa, who became the antipope John XXI. When Casa occupied the throne of St. Peter, the Medici Bank became the official financial agent of the Vatican, collecting tithes, managing revenues, financing papal projects across Europe. The bank opened branches in London, Bruges, Lyon, Rome, and Venice. By the time Giovanni died, the Medici were the wealthiest family in Florence and their bank was the most powerful financial institution in Europe. Giovanni's public face was carefully modest. He funded the construction of the sacristy of San Lorenzo in Florence, a major architectural commission, but did not seek public credit for it. He paid for the redesign of the Ospedale degli Innocenti, Europe's first foundling hospital. When the city needed someone to finance the competition for the Florence baptistry doors, the project that launched the career of Lorenzo Ghiberti and, indirectly, the whole tradition of Renaissance sculpture. Giovanni backed it. He gave without appearing to give, which in the political culture of a Florentine republic was, paradoxically, the most effective form of giving. Cosimo the Elder, the Shadow King. Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1389 and known to history as Cosimo il Vecchio, Cosimo the Elder. Inherited his father's bank and his father's political instincts, and used both to consolidate a form of power that Florence's republican constitution had never anticipated and could not easily define or limit. He held no permanent public office. He never declared himself ruler of anything. He was, formally, a private citizen. And for 35 years he was the most powerful person in Florence. The mechanism was credit. Cosimo understood that in a society where fortunes were made and lost in commercial cycles, the ability to extend or withdraw credit was a form of political control more reliable than any legal authority. He lent money to noble families, to artisans, to political rivals, and the people who owed him money became, by the logic of obligation, his supporters. When the Albizzi family, the old Florentine oligarchy that resented the Medici's rise, managed to have Cosimo arrested and exiled in 1433, the city's economy began to slow immediately. Within a year, Cosimo's allies won the elections to the Signoria, the city's governing council, and Cosimo returned in triumph. The Albizzi were exiled in his place. He never needed to raise an army. He just needed to be gone long enough for people to notice what his absence felt like. The cultural patronage Cosimo practiced was not separable from his politics. He understood that in a city governed by appearances, by the reputation for virtue and civic generosity that determined who could lead and who would be followed, spending on art and architecture was a form of political investment. When he financed Brunelleschi's completion of the Dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, the largest dome built since antiquity, the defining feature of the Florentine skyline for 6 centuries. He was buying legitimacy that no amount of electoral manipulation could have provided. When he commissioned Donatello's Bronze David, the first freestanding nude male sculpture since antiquity, an image of republican heroism that he placed in the courtyard of his own palace, he was making a claim about the values of the city that he effectively governed. He founded the Platonic Academy in Florence, placing the philosopher Marsilio Ficino at its head and funding his translation of Plato's complete works from Greek into Latin, a project that reintroduced Platonic thought to Western Europe and helped define the intellectual character of the Renaissance. When Cosimo died in 1464, the Signoria voted him the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. It was the highest honor the Roman Republic had ever bestowed, and the Florentines knew the reference they were making. Lorenzo the Magnificent, the apex. Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo de Medici, born in 1449, known universally as Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, was the most celebrated member of the dynasty and the figure whose name became synonymous with the Italian Renaissance at its height. He was 20 years old when he assumed leadership of Florence in 1469, and he brought to the position qualities that neither his grandfather nor his father Piero had possessed in the same combination: genuine intellectual brilliance, personal charm of an extraordinary order, poetic talent, and an instinct for the political relationships between Italian states that made him, for most of his adult life, the essential negotiator of Italian affairs. Lorenzo wrote poetry in Tuscan vernacular that was taken seriously by the literary culture of his time and is still read. He collected ancient sculpture, coins, gems, and manuscripts with the systematic passion of a scholar rather than the acquisitive reflex of a rich man. He could discuss Platonic philosophy with Ficino and Angelo Poliziano, who was simultaneously one of the greatest classical scholars of the age and Lorenzo's close friend. And he kept the young Michelangelo in his household, eating at his table, learning from the classical sculptures in the Medici gardens, absorbing the Neoplatonic ideas that would shape every work he made for the rest of his life. The cultural achievement of Lorenzo's Florence was real and was directly connected to his patronage and his personal engagement. Botticelli painted the birth of Venus and Primavera for the Medici Circle, works whose mythological programs were developed in consultation with the humanist scholars Lorenzo supported. Leonardo da Vinci received early recognition in Florence under Lorenzo, though his relationship with the Medici was less central than Michelangelo's would be. The city Lorenzo governed was, for roughly 2 decades, the most concentrated center of artistic and intellectual production in Europe. The Puzzi Conspiracy, Easter Sunday in the Cathedral. On the morning of April 26, 1478, Lorenzo de Medici and his younger brother Giuliano attended High Mass at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. It was Easter Sunday, and the cathedral was full, perhaps 10,000 people crowded into the nave. What the congregation did not know was that among them were a group of armed men with instructions to kill both Medici brothers at the moment of the elevation of the host, when the crowd's attention would be focused on the altar and the noise of the ceremony would cover the sound of struggle. The conspiracy had been organized by the Puzzi family, Florence's second most powerful banking dynasty, who had been systematically excluded from political influence by the Medici. And backed, with carefully maintained deniability, by Pope Sixtus IV. The Pope had his own grievances. The Medici had opposed his territorial ambitions in the Romagna, and he had recently transferred a valuable contract from the Medici Bank to the Puzzi. The conspiracy was not, at its core, a Florentine affair. It was an attempt by the papacy to replace a difficult ally with a more compliant one. The signal for the attack was the elevation of the host. 2 priests. The conspirators had originally recruited trained soldiers, but both men refused at the last moment to commit murder in a church, and priests were substituted, rushed at Giuliano de' Medici and stabbed him 19 times. He died on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo, attacked simultaneously, managed to draw his sword, take a wound to the neck, vault over the altar rail, and lock himself in the sacristy with a group of friends. A door of bronze stood between him and his attackers, and it held. The conspiracy failed at the moment it seemed to succeed. The Uffizi had assumed that once the Medici were dead, the Florentine people would welcome their removal as a liberation from tyranny. Instead, the city turned on the conspirators with a violence that shocked contemporaries. Jacopo de' Uffizi, the head of the family, rode through the streets calling for people and liberty, and was met with silence, then stones. The Archbishop of Pisa, Francesco Salviati, who had coordinated the plot and attempted to seize the Palazzo della Signoria simultaneously with the cathedral attack, was captured and hanged, still in his ceremonial robes, from a window of the palace. Several dozen conspirators were executed over the following days. The bodies of some were thrown into the Arno. Jacopo de' Uffizi was buried, dug up by a mob, dragged through the city, and thrown into the river. The Uffizi name was erased from public life, their coats of arms were chiseled from buildings, their property was confiscated, members of the family were exiled or imprisoned. Lorenzo emerged from the crisis more powerful than before. He had been attacked in a church on Easter Sunday by men acting with papal support, and the city had defended him. The political lesson was not lost on anyone. The Medici popes, taking Rome. After Lorenzo's death in 1492 and the subsequent humiliation of his son Piero, who surrendered Florentine territorial assets to the invading French King Charles VIII without serious resistance and was expelled from the city by an outraged population, the Medici spent nearly 2 decades in exile. The city fell under the influence of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, who preached against wealth, art, and the moral corruption of the church, organized bonfires in which books, paintings, mirrors, and fashionable clothing were burned, and was eventually himself burned as a heretic in 1498 in the same piazza where he had held his bonfires. The Medici returned to Florence in 1512 with the help of a Spanish army, and the following year achieved something their founder Giovanni de' Medici could not have imagined. Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was elected pope and took the name Leo X. He was 37 years old and had been a cardinal since the age of 13. Leo X's pontificate was one of the most culturally productive in papal history. He continued and expanded the patronage of Raphael, who was simultaneously decorating the Vatican stands and producing the Sistine Tapestry cartoons and serving as chief architect of St. Peter's, and maintained Michelangelo on a series of projects for the Medici family. His court was celebrated across Europe for its music, theater, scholarship, and magnificent expenditure. He is reported to have said, on his election, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." The enjoyment was expensive. Leo financed it partly through the aggressive sale of indulgences, payments to the church in exchange for reductions in purgatorial punishment, and it was specifically the sale of indulgences to fund the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica that provoked Martin Luther, in 1517, to publish his 95 Theses. The Medici Pope's cultural generosity inadvertently triggered the Protestant Reformation. A second Medici Pope, Clement VII. Giulio de' Medici, an illegitimate nephew of Lorenzo the Magnificent, reigned from 1523 to 1534. His pontificate culminated in the sack of Rome in 1527, when the troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V looted the city for months in an episode of destruction that effectively ended the Roman High Renaissance. Clement himself was besieged in the Castel Sant'Angelo for months before reaching terms with the emperor. In 1530, using imperial military support, he suppressed the last Florentine republic and established the Medici as hereditary rulers of the city, transforming what had been, for centuries, a republic into a principality. Cosimo I and the Grand Duchy. The man who consolidated that principality into something durable was Cosimo I de' Medici. Born in 1519, a member of a cadet branch of the family, and elected Duke of Florence in 1537 after the assassination of the previous Duke, Alessandro, by a distant relative. Cosimo I was 18 years old when he took power, and the Florentine oligarchs who chose him expected to manage him. They misjudged. Cosimo I governed with an efficiency and brutality that had no precedent in Medici history. He built a professional army and a navy. He expanded the Florentine state by conquest, incorporating Siena in 1555 after a war that involved the systematic destruction of agricultural land and the death of a significant portion of Siena's population. In 1569 he received from Pope Pius V the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany, the first such title in Italian history, ranking him above every other Italian ruler except the kings of Naples and Sicily. The administrative building he commissioned in 1560, the Uffizi, meaning offices, was designed by Giorgio Vasari to house the government bureaucracy of the Grand Duchy. On its top floor, Cosimo installed his art collection. That collection, expanded by his successors, eventually became one of the greatest art museums in the world. The building that was designed to house accountants and clerks became the home of Botticelli's most famous paintings. The Uffizi is perhaps the most consequential administrative building in the history of art. The Last Gift. Anna Maria Luisa's Pact. The dynasty that Giovanni de' Medici had built ended, as dynasties often do, not in battle but in biology. The last Grand Duke of Tuscany, John Gaston de' Medici, died in 1737 without an heir. The Grand Duchy passed by treaty to the House of Lorraine, the Habsburg cadet branch, and a new foreign dynasty took control of Tuscany. The 3 centuries of Medici rule were over. What happened next was the result of a negotiation conducted by John Gaston's sister, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, the Electress Palatine. She was 69 years old, childless, and the last surviving member of the dynasty. The new rulers of Tuscany expected to inherit not only the territory but the collections, the paintings, sculptures, antiquities, manuscripts, coins, jewelry, and furnishings that the Medici had accumulated over 300 years. These collections, transported to Vienna or dispersed across the Habsburg Empire, would have been lost to Florence forever. Anna Maria Luisa negotiated a different outcome. In the Patto di Famiglia, the Family Pact, signed on October 31, 1737, she agreed to the transfer of the Grand Duchy to the Lorraines on one condition. Every work of art, every object, every piece of the Medici collections was to remain in Florence permanently, as public property, for the benefit of the people of Tuscany and for the attraction of visitors from all over the world. The collections could not be alienated, removed, or exported. They belonged to Florence. The legal weight of this stipulation has held for nearly 300 years. The Uffizi Gallery. With Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Leonardo's Annunciation, Raphael's portraits, Michelangelo's Doni Tonda, Caravaggio, Titian, Rembrandt, is accessible to the public because of a clause written by a 69-year-old woman who had outlived her entire family and used the last power available to her to make a permanent gift to a city that was no longer, strictly speaking, hers to give. Anna Maria Luisa died in 1743. She is buried in the Basilica of San Lorenzo in Florence, in the Medici family crypt. The collections she protected receive approximately 2 million visitors per year. What 3 centuries built? The Medici did not invent the Renaissance. The intellectual and artistic developments that constitute the Renaissance had roots in the 13th and 14th centuries, in Dante, Petrarch, Giotto, and the broader recovery of classical learning that had been underway since the 12th century. What the Medici did was provide the specific conditions, money, security, intellectual community, and sustained patronage, that allowed the Renaissance to achieve its most concentrated and influential expression in Florence between roughly 1430 and 1530. Without Cosimo the Elder's financial support, Brunelleschi's dome, the engineering achievement that demonstrated that the ambitions of antiquity were not beyond the capacity of the modern world, might not have been completed. Without the Platonic Academy that Cosimo founded, the recovery of Platonic philosophy might have proceeded differently, and the intellectual framework of Renaissance humanism would have been shaped by different sources. Without Lorenzo's household, the young Michelangelo would not have spent his formative years surrounded by ancient sculpture and Neoplatonic thought, and the work he made afterward would have been different in ways that are impossible to specify but impossible to ignore. They were also, at various points, corrupt, violent, manipulative, and responsible for real human suffering. The political system Cosimo the Elder built required the systematic exclusion of his opponents. Lorenzo's response to the Pizzi conspiracy involved executions, collective punishment, and a diplomatic crisis that cost Florence the Papal alliance for years. Cosimo I's expansion of Tuscany involved war and displacement on a scale that modern historians have not forgotten even if later centuries chose to. The Medici were not, by any honest assessment, good people who happened to love art. They were powerful people who used art, among other things, to exercise and legitimize their power. Both of these things, the cultural achievement and the human cost, belong to any honest account of what the Medici were and what they did. The dome is still there. The paintings are still there. The city is still there. And the document that kept the paintings in the city was signed by the last Perso.